The Phantom Enemy. Sterling Locke. Throughout the annals of history, tyranny has rarely worn the mask of tyranny. It comes instead clothed in the garments of necessity, draped in the colors of protection, and armed with the language of crisis. The iron fist is rarely presented as such. Rather, it is wrapped in velvet, declared to be the hand of a guardian shielding the people from unseen dangers. Yet the shield, once accepted, becomes a shackle. This pamphlet concerns itself with one of the oldest and deadliest artifices of power, the invention of vague enemies. To preserve their dominion, rulers and factions alike have always conjured shadows in the minds of men, phantoms without name or face, whose threat is said to lurk in every corner, and whose defeat demands obedience without question. Against a defined foe, citizens may weigh the danger and debate the remedy. Against a phantom, resistance itself becomes treason, for who can defend a danger that might exist? Vagueness is thus the perfect ally of despotism, for liberty suffers not most when dangers are real, but when fears are vague. A real danger can be met with courage, proportion, and resolve. But a vague danger, amorphous, invisible, ever-shifting, can never be conquered, only obeyed. It multiplies endlessly, justifying ever greater incursions into life, speech, and conscience, until the people themselves no longer know whether they are ruled by law or by fear. This is no idle speculation. The record of human society testifies with clarity. Vague enemies have been the fuel of inquisitions, the lifeblood of empires, and the excuse of every regime that sought to bind its people in silence and submission. From Rome's suspicion of conspirators, to monarchs denouncing traitors too numerous to count, to modern powers whispering of hidden saboteurs and subversives, always the same script is performed. Liberty often dies by the whisper of imagined enemies, rather than the sword of open foes. If a people consent to surrender freedom in order to guard against phantoms, they will soon find themselves chained by the very guardians they trusted. For vague fear is the most inexhaustible resource of power, and its price is nothing less than the dignity of man. The Invention of Enemies. The practice of inventing enemies is as ancient as authority itself. No ruler, however strong his armies or rich his coffers, can long maintain dominion without the consent, or at least the resignation, of the governed. And men, reluctant to yield, must be made to fear. When no sufficient threat arises of its own, the art of statecraft has often provided one. Antiquity's phantoms. Consider the late Roman Republic. Already weakened by internal strife, ambitious leaders discovered that nothing cemented their power so effectively as the specter of plots and conspiracies. Catiline, whether guilty or merely convenient, was made the emblem of hidden treachery, and Cicero, by magnifying the danger, won extraordinary powers. Later emperors perfected the tactic. Vague denunciations of enemies of the state, justified purges of rivals, censorship of speech, and the perpetual militarization of public life. Rome, once the proud guardian of liberty under law, became a prison to its own citizens, not because of invasion, but because of fear. Nor was Rome alone. In Athens, accusations of impiety and subversion proved a fertile tool for silencing dissent. Socrates himself was condemned not for raising arms but for raising questions, and the vagueness of his alleged corruption of youth made defense impossible. To question the prevailing orthodoxy was to become an enemy, though no crime could be precisely named. Here, as elsewhere, the phantom enemy was a solvent of liberty. The monarch's convenience. In the medieval monarchies of Europe, the same pattern reappeared. Kings, jealous of their prerogatives, declared that unseen plots endangered the realm. Dissidents became heretics, critics became traitors, and both categories were conveniently broad. The Inquisition, nominally a defense of the faith, operated in truth as a defense of authority itself. For who could say what thoughts or whispers might be construed as heresy? The vagueness was the point. Where law is unclear, obedience becomes the only safety. In England, monarchs of both crown and parliament denounced enemies of the kingdom without ever fully defining the term. To oppose taxation, to resist arbitrary imprisonment, to question the king's prerogative, each at times was labeled treason. The result was not unity, but terror. Men learned to measure their words, to conceal their opinions, to live not as free citizens but as cautious subjects, lest they be accused of serving some phantom foe of the state. Modern echoes. Nor has the modern age outgrown this device. Indeed, it has perfected it. One century saw the rise of regimes that thrived on the perpetual naming of invisible adversaries. Citizens were told that saboteurs, spies, and enemies lurked everywhere. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children their parents, not because guilt was proved, but because guilt was presumed. And when the enemy is presumed everywhere, the state's power is required everywhere. In other lands, the bogeymen changed their faces, sometimes the bourgeoisie, sometimes the cosmopolitan, sometimes the foreigner or alien. Always the category was broad enough to ensnare anyone inconvenient to those in power. Vague enough to terrify, flexible enough to expand, and convenient enough to secure obedience. By such means, entire peoples were subdued, without the rulers needing to raise a sword against them. Fear did the work more efficiently than steel. The psychology of fear. Why does vagueness magnify obedience? Because man fears what he cannot see. A defined danger. An invading army, a named criminal, can be met with courage, planning, and proportion. But an undefined danger is limitless. It could be anywhere, anyone, at any time. And so the natural instinct of self-preservation drives men to seek safety in submission. The ruler knows this well. By speaking often of hidden enemies, he compels the people not only to obey, but to police themselves. They whisper less. They think less. They retreat into silence, for silence alone seems safe. Thus vagueness creates a double bondage. Men are bound by the state's decrees, and bound again by their own fears. In this fashion, vague enemies become the most profitable of all inventions. They require no proof, only proclamation. They can never be defeated, only managed. And their management always requires more power, more surveillance, more obedience. The people, longing for safety, barter liberty piece by piece until they awaken to find themselves chained not by an enemy from without, but by guardians within. 2. The enemy without a face. If tyranny finds its nourishment in fear, then its richest harvest is reaped when the enemy is faceless. A known adversary can be fought, bargained with, or at least comprehended. A faceless adversary, by contrast, is infinite. It cannot be named, so it cannot be defeated. It cannot be confined, so it can justify any measure. It cannot be disproved, for absence itself is taken as proof of its cunning. Thus, the faceless enemy is the tyrant's greatest ally, for it transforms power into a permanent necessity. The all-purpose justification. When the foe is vague, every failure of the state is explained by his invisible hand. Crops fail? It is sabotage. The treasury runs dry? It is the enemy's conspiracy. A protest arises? It is the work of infiltrators. Thus, the rulers need never confess error or folly. They need only invoke the phantom, and their own people will supply the excuse. In this way, vagueness arms authority, not only against dissent, but against accountability. For who dares demand an account from leaders who claim to be guarding against shadows? To question them is to risk being counted among the shadows oneself. The elastic threat. The genius of a faceless enemy lies also in his elasticity. He can be stretched or contracted as necessity demands. In times of calm, he may be invoked lightly to remind the people that vigilance is owed to their rulers. In times of crisis, he may be made vast and monstrous, justifying emergency powers, suspensions of law, or the silencing of critics. Always the enemy expands or contracts to fit the ambitions of those in command. And when the people begin to weary of the same story, the enemy can be repainted with new colors, but the same vagueness. Yesterday it was conspirators, today it is traitors, tomorrow it is heretics, subversives, extremists, or simply those who question. The mask changes, but the facelessness remains. The creation of the other. Here lies the true danger. The faceless enemy is not merely an abstraction. It is a category designed to capture any person. By making the other into a perpetual foe, rulers divide the people against themselves. Suspicion becomes a civic duty, denunciation a mark of loyalty, and because the enemy has no face, any face may become his. Thus do nations devour their own. Neighbors watch neighbors, parents fear their children, friends grow silent, lest a jest or a question be taken as allegiance to the unseen foe. A people thus divided are no longer a people. They are fragments, each fearful of the other, all obedient to the one authority that promises protection. In such a state, liberty does not merely decline, it withers at the root. For liberty presupposes trust, that a man may speak, act, and live without presumption of guilt. But when every man may be suspected of serving the phantom, trust collapses, and with it, the soil in which liberty grows. 3. The assault on speech. If property is the fruit of labor, then speech is the fruit of conscience. To silence speech is therefore to deny man's very nature as a reasoning being. Yet under the regime of the faceless enemy, speech is the first and most natural casualty. Fear as a censor. When rulers invoke vague dangers, the field of forbidden words expands without limit. One may not speak well of certain practices, for fear of aiding the enemy. One may not question certain policies, lest dissent give comfort to the foe. One may not even ask for proof of the danger, for to doubt is itself suspicious. Thus fear becomes the censor's hand. Men no longer weigh their words by truth but by safety. They ask not, "Is this just?" but, "Will this be taken as treason?" In such an atmosphere, speech does not vanish at once but dies by inches. Humor grows timid, criticism cautious, philosophy silent, until the nation speaks only in the approved tones of obedience. Vagueness as a weapon. The vagueness of the enemy ensures the vagueness of forbidden speech, for if the foe is undefined, then anything might aid him. A poem, a pamphlet, a sermon, a jest, all may be accused of sowing disloyalty. The line between loyal and disloyal speech is never fixed. It shifts as rulers find convenient. And what is the consequence? Men police not only their tongues, but their thoughts. For when one cannot know what is safe to say, one ceases even to think it. Thus tyranny penetrates deeper than chains or prisons. It enters the mind, colonizes conscience, and extinguishes the very capacity for dissent. Violence against thought. To punish a man for his words is, in truth, to claim dominion over his very soul. It is to say, your mind is not your own. Your conscience is a possession of the state. And when rulers dare such a claim, they declare the people to be slaves in the most absolute sense. For slavery does not begin with the lash. It begins when a man is told he may not think, or that if he thinks, he may not speak, or that if he speaks, he may not live. In such a condition, no matter his possessions or his outward freedoms, he is bound in the deepest chains of all, the chains upon the soul. Thus the assault on speech is the clearest mark of tyranny, ancient or modern. When vague enemies are invoked to silence unwelcome voices, liberty is not merely threatened, it is already wounded, perhaps mortally. For a people who dare not speak cannot long remain free. The price of shadows. We have thus far traced the pattern. Rulers invent enemies, make them faceless, and then silence speech in the name of combating them. The pattern is ancient, yet ever renewed, subtle, yet obvious to those willing to see. Always it leads to the same destination: a people, fearful, silent, divided and obedient, ruled not by reason but by shadows. The lesson is grave. Liberty does not perish only when armies march or kings usurp. It perishes also, and perhaps more often, when citizens consent to be ruled by fear of the unseen. For fear, when vague, has no end, and power that feeds on fear is never satisfied. Therefore, let it be understood: to guard liberty, one must be suspicious not only of enemies abroad or conspirators within, but also of those who multiply enemies without face or name. For the phantom foe is not the true danger. The true danger is the authority that claims the right to protect you from him.